the chair she was given. Eleanor Whitfield walked into her own restaurant wearing a torn coat and shoes soaked through with rain. Nobody recognized the billionaire chief executive quietly testing the empire her family had built. The manager ordered her thrown out. The guests looked at her with open contempt, and the waiters turned their faces away as though she didn't exist. Only Marcus Doyle, a single father one bad night away from losing his job, pulled out an empty chair and said, "You can sit here." He had no idea that one small act of decency was about to expose a secret large enough to shake the entire company to its foundation. Rain fell hard over Chicago the night Whitfield House filled to capacity, its windows glowing gold against the storm, while a fundraising dinner for something called the Every Seat Fund packed every table with investors and minor celebrities in expensive coats. Inside, the air smelled of seared butter and candle wax, a string quartet worked through something quiet in the corner, and servers in crisp black aprons moved between tables with practiced efficiency. Crystal caught the light from low chandeliers, and somewhere near the bar a woman in emerald silk laughed too loudly at something a man in a tailored suit had said. Outside, the storm turned the street into a smear of red taillights and slick pavement, a world that felt impossibly far from the warm glow inside. Eleanor left her car 2 blocks away and walked the last stretch in clothes deliberately chosen to look worn, her hair tangled by the wind, her face bare of the makeup that usually made her instantly recognizable. Her shoes filled with cold water before she reached the corner, and she found herself gripping her own arms against the chill, startled by how quickly the discomfort stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling real. She wanted to see her own restaurant the way a stranger with nothing would see it, and she suspected, though she hoped otherwise, that the answer wouldn't flatter her. Some small, stubborn part of her still hoped the values printed so carefully in the company's annual reports actually lived somewhere inside that building, not just on paper. The hostess looked her over once, decided everything she needed to know in half a second, and announced the restaurant was completely full. Even though a dozen empty tables sat visible through the glass behind her. Eleanor lingered a moment, waiting to see if the young woman might reconsider, but she'd already turned her attention to a couple in furs stepping out of a car at the curb. Colin Marsh, the general manager, appeared within moments and told security to move her along before any paying guest noticed her near the entrance. Not one server stepped forward to object. Several looked away entirely, unwilling to risk their manager's disapproval over a woman who could offer them nothing. Marcus had just finished serving a demanding foretop near the back when he noticed her shivering by the door, and something about the exhaustion on her face stopped him mid-thought. He was 40, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who'd once hauled crates of produce for a living, with a calm, weathered face that made guests trust him within 30 seconds of meeting him. 10 years earlier he'd have been the one deciding who sat where, running his own dining room with his wife beside him, and some part of that old instinct never fully left him. He walked past Colin without asking permission and pulled out a chair at table 14, one of the best tables in the house, reserved that night for a donor who hadn't yet arrived. Colin hissed that the table was for someone important. Marcus answered simply that a cold woman was important too. He brought her warm water, draped his own jacket over her chair, and quietly used his employee meal credit to order her a bowl of soup rather than let her sit there with nothing. Eleanor studied him as he moved, the steadiness in his hands, the total absence of performance in his kindness, as if he treated her this way simply because it was right, not because anyone was watching. When she glanced at the menu and saw Every Seat Fund printed in elegant script beneath the restaurant's name, she asked him, almost without meaning to, why a charity program built to feed people like her had left her standing in the rain in the first place. Marcus didn't have an easy answer, and his hesitation told her he'd wondered the same thing many times. He explained, without complaint, that he used to co-own a small restaurant with his late wife. A modest place a couple of neighborhoods over, where regulars knew each other's names and nobody was ever turned away hungry. After she died following a long illness, the medical debt swallowed the business whole, and Marcus found himself starting over as a waiter at a restaurant that bore no resemblance to his old dream. His daughter Nora was 19 now, mostly away at community college, but he still worked double shifts most days to stay ahead of what remained of the debt. Some nights after closing he sat alone in the kitchen with the bill spread across the table, letting himself remember his wife laughing behind the line, flour dusted across her forearms, before folding the memory away and going to bed so he could be up again by 6. He rarely spoke of her to coworkers unless asked directly, not from secrecy, but because grief, in his experience, didn't improve from being handled carelessly by well-meaning people who understood little. At Whitfield House he'd become known for remembering every regular's name and treating every guest the same regardless of what they wore, a habit that made him popular with customers and deeply irritating to Colin, who preferred servers who understood which guests deserved real attention. Marcus had filed 3 separate complaints over the past year about tips disappearing from the shared pool and about charity meals being logged on nights he'd personally watched people turned away at the door. Every complaint had vanished into the company's system without acknowledgement. Eleanor asked why he kept helping people who could never repay him, especially when it put his job at risk. Marcus told her he remembered what it felt like to walk into a beautiful place and be looked at as though he didn't belong. He didn't mention that Colin had already decided days earlier to fire him by week's end, for reasons the paperwork would only describe as poor cultural fit. Eleanor glanced past his shoulder at a small screen behind the host stand, where the nightly dashboard quietly displayed a running tally. Her stomach tightened when she saw the restaurant crediting itself with 47 charity meals served that evening. She was the only person without a table who'd been let inside all night, and only because one waiter had defied his manager to make room for her. 3 weeks earlier, an envelope with no return address had arrived at Eleanor's office. Inside was a spreadsheet claiming the Every Seat Fund had spent more than $18 million over 4 years, while almost no charitable organization on record could confirm ever receiving a single meal. She'd brought the numbers to Prestondale, the company's chief operating officer, and within 2 days he'd returned a flawless report insisting the discrepancy was nothing more than a data entry error. Something about the speed and polish of that answer hadn't sat right with her, so rather than press him further, she'd decided to see the truth herself, without warning anyone she was coming. Her father, long before he died and left her the company, had once told her the fastest way to understand any business was to walk through its front door as someone with nothing to offer it. That night she intended to test 3 things. Whether staff would actually serve someone who looked poor, whether the celebrated charity program was real in any meaningful sense, and whether management lived up to even a fraction of the values printed on the company's own website. Every employee she encountered failed that test except Marcus, and what disturbed her more was realizing he had no idea the very program failing to help her had once been announced to the public under her own family's name. Colin, suspicious of the attention Marcus was giving a woman with clearly no money, pulled the young manager on duty aside and demanded the receipts from table 14 be reviewed immediately. When he discovered Marcus had personally paid for the soup out of his own meal credit rather than expensing it, he didn't soften, he simply began composing, in his head, a different accusation to use against him before the night was through. Colin called Marcus into the back office mid-shift, his voice already sharp with a certainty that made objection feel pointless. He accused Marcus of bringing an unauthorized homeless woman into the VIP section, damaging the restaurant's image, and misusing company resources without approval. Marcus calmly produced the receipt proving he'd paid himself. For a moment Colin's expression flickered with frustration before he pivoted smoothly to a new charge. He announced that $800 had just gone missing from the tip pool safe, and moments later, as though summoned by fate, that exact amount turned up folded inside Marcus's locker. Marcus understood immediately he'd been set up, but understanding a trap and proving it were very different things, and he had no camera footage or willing witness. His co-workers, several of whom knew perfectly well he'd never steal from people he worked beside every night, said nothing, each quietly calculating how replaceable they themselves might be if they spoke up. Eleanor, still seated at table 14 in her borrowed identity, watched Colin march Marcus toward the office and felt something cold settle in her chest as she began to understand what was happening. She listened from a distance as Colin pressured Marcus to sign a written admission of guilt in exchange for forfeiting his remaining wages, a tidy arrangement that would leave no formal record of any dispute. Colin slid the paper and a pen across the desk, telling him this could all be over in 30 seconds if he just signed his name. Marcus looked at the paper a long moment, then back up at Colin, and said quietly that he'd spent his whole life building a name people could trust, and he wasn't about to sign it away on a lie just to make Colin's night easier. He refused to sign anything, accepting the loss of his job rather than accepting a lie about who he was, and walked out with his head high and his pockets nearly empty. Before leaving what he believed might be for the last time, he checked once more on the woman he'd helped, offering her the number of a nearby shelter and the last bus ticket folded in his wallet. Eleanor almost told him the truth right there, the words rising in her throat before she swallowed them back down, choosing instead to wait and see exactly how Colin would describe the night to the people above him. It was a small mercy that Marcus, even freshly unemployed and humiliated, still thought first about whether a stranger had somewhere safe to sleep. 10 minutes after Marcus disappeared into the rain, Colin called Prestondale directly, his voice bright with satisfaction as he reported that the man behind the anonymous letters had finally been dealt with. By morning, every employee of Whitfield House had been summoned to an emergency meeting, chairs pulled into rows in the same dining room that had been full of laughter and wineglasses hours before. Eleanor walked in wearing an impeccable charcoal suit, flanked by 2 attorneys and a forensic auditor, and the color drained from more than a few faces as staff realized the disheveled woman from the night before and their chief executive were one and the same. Someone dropped a stack of menus near the host stand, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence that followed, and nobody moved to pick them up. A young server who'd refused to make eye contact with Eleanor the night before now stared fixedly at the floor, her face burning, while others exchanged nervous glances, trying to remember exactly what they'd said and to whom. Colin recovered fastest, insisting loudly that he'd recognized Eleanor almost immediately and had only played the difficult manager to help her complete whatever test she was running. A handful of servers echoed him weakly, claiming they too had planned to step in before Marcus beat them to it, though none could explain why they'd said nothing at the time. Eleanor let the room finish talking before she played a recording pulled from a small device sewn into her coat, and the dining room fell utterly silent as it replayed every mocking comment and every order to remove her from the premises. She suspended Colin on the spot and demanded Marcus's immediate reinstatement. Though when her assistant tried his number, the call went straight to voicemail, since Marcus had turned his phone off the night before, certain any call from the company could only be another attempt to buy his silence. Preston arrived late and entirely unbothered. Rather than apologizing for anything, he criticized Eleanor for staging what he called a reckless, unauthorized disguise that had damaged the brand and possibly violated her own staff's privacy. He demanded the board formally review her judgment as chief executive, framing her undercover visit not as diligence but as instability, a narrative he'd clearly begun preparing long before he walked into the room. He spoke slowly, choosing words designed to sound like concern rather than attack, and more than one board member nodded along before catching themselves. Eleanor recognized the maneuver for what it was, but with the board's confidence already fragile after months of Preston's quiet lobbying, she understood she couldn't simply dismiss the threat. Preston told her, with the calm precision of a man who already knew the outcome he wanted, that if she couldn't produce hard evidence of real fraud within 72 hours, the board would move to suspend her from her own company. In its way, that was an admission that something worth hiding truly existed, though Eleanor seemed to be the only person in the room who grasped the weight of what he just revealed. 2 days later, Eleanor found Marcus at a small diner where he'd picked up temporary shifts washing dishes and helping with prep, unwilling to sit at home while bills kept arriving. The place smelled of frying bacon and burned coffee, the linoleum floor scuffed pale near the register from decades of foot traffic. Marcus stood at the sink with his sleeves rolled to the elbow when he looked up and saw her standing awkwardly near the door in her expensive coat. He didn't smile or rush over, just wiped his hands on a towel and asked evenly what she was doing there. She offered him everything that seemed reasonable. His old job back, every dollar of missing wages, a promotion into restaurant management, and formal compensation for a wrongful termination that never should have happened. Marcus turned all of it down, not out of pride, but because he understood the offer solved nothing beyond his own bank account. He told her plainly that the problem was never only Colin, that servers and cooks and hosts had been filing complaints for months about missing tips and falsified charity records, and that nobody above them had bothered to listen until a billionaire experienced the same treatment for one evening. His words landed harder than he probably intended, forcing Eleanor to confront how far she'd drifted from the people actually running her restaurants day to day. He finally admitted he'd written the anonymous letter himself, choosing not to sign it because Preston controlled human resources and had already quietly pushed out 2 other employees who dared speak up. Eleanor asked for his help untangling the truth, and he agreed only after setting 3 conditions. No innocent employee would face retaliation, every stolen dollar of tip money would be returned in full, and whatever the investigation uncovered would be made public, even if the trail led back to her own office. That fragile agreement, built on suspicion rather than gratitude, became the foundation of everything that followed. Within days, Eleanor's internal auditor, Renee Castillo, discovered that all three of Marcus's earlier complaints had been opened using Preston's personal login before being deleted from the system entirely. Renee was 35, sharp and cautious by nature, and had joined the company years earlier believing Preston to be one of the few executives who genuinely valued careful, honest work, which made the discovery all the more unsettling for her personally. Working quietly through the weekend, Eleanor, Marcus, and Renee pulled records from 32 different Whitfield restaurants and began noticing a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Each location logged dozens of charity meals nightly through the Every Seat Fund, triggering matching reimbursements from a foundation account, while outside food suppliers billed the company for ingredients that had apparently never been delivered to anyone. A portion of every server's tip pool was quietly diverted under the label of a voluntary charitable contribution that no employee remembered agreeing to. Every supplier connected to these transactions traced back through a web of shell companies to associates who'd worked with Preston for years. Marcus, drawing on instincts sharpened by years running his own restaurant, noticed something the professional auditors had missed entirely. Every phantom charity meal across every location was logged under table number 88, a table that existed in no floor plan anywhere in the company. Over 4 years, the total pulled from the program exceeded $18 million, a figure large enough that even Renee, who'd seen plenty of creative accounting in her career, had to read the final report twice. She sat back from her laptop in the small conference room they'd claimed for themselves, rubbing her eyes, and admitted quietly that she'd trusted Preston since the day he hired her fresh out of graduate school, and that the numbers in front of her now felt like a betrayal of something more personal than company policy. Marcus, watching her from across the table, said nothing for a moment, then told her that trusting the wrong person didn't make her foolish, only human. What mattered now was what she chose to do with what she knew. Sensing the investigation closing in, Preston began spreading a different story entirely, telling select board members and journalists that Eleanor intended to shutter dozens of underperforming restaurants and lay off hundreds of workers to cover up her own financial mismanagement. Public sentiment shifted quickly. Employees who'd never met Eleanor grew anxious about their jobs, and business reporters began openly questioning whether she still had the judgment to lead a company this size. Marcus, once simply a waiter who'd shown kindness to a stranger, found himself recast in headlines as the man who'd manipulated a vulnerable executive into a reckless publicity stunt in exchange, the story implied, for a promised position of power. Just as the narrative against him hardened, Preston released a short video clip showing Marcus accepting a folded envelope of cash from Colin's hand, framing it as proof he'd been a willing participant in the very fraud he claimed to be exposing. The clip spread quickly through news segments and commentary shows, cropped tightly enough that no context could survive the editing, and within a single afternoon Marcus's name had become shorthand online for exactly the kind of opportunism he'd spent his whole life trying not to be. In reality, the video had been recorded months earlier and stripped of the audio that would have explained everything. The envelope contained tip money Colin had forced Marcus to redistribute back to management as an unofficial tax on honest work. Overnight, Marcus became the target of public anger, and details about his bankruptcy and his late wife's medical debt were dug up and circulated without his consent, turning his private grief into a headline. Strangers filled comment threads with theories about his character, calling him a con man who'd used a dying wife as a sympathetic backstory to manipulate a lonely executive. Nora called him in tears one evening after a classmate showed her one of the articles, asking if any of it was true, and Marcus had to sit on the edge of his bed and explain as gently as he could that sometimes the truth takes longer to travel than a lie. He considered walking away entirely, worried the growing scrutiny would eventually reach Nora and disrupt the quiet, ordinary life he'd worked so hard to give her. Eleanor, for the first time in the entire ordeal, resisted every instinct to solve the problem with money or legal maneuvering, and instead stood before reporters herself and stated plainly that she alone had asked Marcus for his help. She admitted publicly that ignoring employee complaints for months, regardless of who had actively hidden them from her, was still a failure of her own leadership, not simply a betrayal by someone beneath her. When reporters pressed her on whether she regretted trusting Preston for so many years, she answered without flinching that regret was a luxury she didn't have time for, and that what mattered now was fixing what had been allowed to break. That admission, uncomfortable and unscripted, was the first thing that made Marcus believe she genuinely wanted the company to change rather than simply wanting to win. Not long after, Renee located the original unedited recording, the one capturing Marcus refusing to keep a single dollar that belonged to his co-workers and demanding Colin return the full amount to the tip pool. Once major outlets published the complete footage, public opinion swung hard the other way. Even with the tide turning, Preston still commanded enough loyalty on the board to force a vote to remove Eleanor the moment it took place. One board member, uneasy about where things were heading, quietly warned Eleanor that Preston intended to sell the entire company the instant he secured her chair. Preston arranged a private meeting with Marcus inside an unopened flagship restaurant, still smelling of fresh paint and sawdust, choosing the empty space deliberately so there'd be no witnesses to what he was about to propose. He offered $2 million in clean funds, ownership of a restaurant of his own, complete forgiveness of every debt still hanging over his household, and a guaranteed financial future for Nora through college and beyond. In exchange, Marcus needed only to publicly claim that Eleanor had orchestrated the entire scheme as manipulation, and that Preston had personally instructed him to lie about Colin's involvement from the beginning. The room smelled of fresh plaster and new wood, the chairs still wrapped in plastic, and Preston's voice echoed slightly off the bare walls as he spoke, as if the emptiness itself were meant to make his offer feel larger. He genuinely believed a struggling single father drowning in debt couldn't possibly turn down money of this size. For a long moment, sitting across from him, Marcus let himself imagine what that kind of money could actually mean for his daughter's future: a paid-off house, a degree finished without loans, the kind of security he hadn't felt since before his wife got sick. He thought of Nora's face, the way she still sometimes flinched at unexpected bills on the counter. For one honest, private moment, the offer didn't feel like a betrayal so much as a rescue. But he understood, with a clarity that surprised even himself, that taking the money would leave thousands of other employees exactly as unprotected as he'd been the week before, trapped inside a system built to reward silence. Wearing a small recording device Renee had prepared in advance, Marcus captured the entire proposal. When Preston noticed the phone in his pocket, he didn't panic, since the recording had already synced to a secure server the moment it started. Preston offered no threats of violence, only a cold promise that no restaurant in the country would ever hire Marcus again once he was finished with him. Eleanor, upon hearing the recording, wanted to release it publicly within the hour, but Marcus urged patience, insisting the attempted bribe alone wouldn't expose the full scope of the fraud without the final piece connecting it directly to Preston. What remained was tracing the last account that had received the stolen $18 million. Days later, Renee discovered that account belonged to a trust once controlled by Eleanor's own late father. Preston had deliberately routed a portion of the stolen funds through that old family trust, ensuring that if the fraud ever surfaced, every thread would appear to lead straight back to Eleanor rather than to him. Eleanor stared at the trust documents for a long time after Renee first showed them to her, recognizing her father's careful handwriting on the original founding papers, feeling sick at how easily his legacy had been twisted into a weapon aimed at her. She trusted Preston with that trust years earlier, back when he still seemed like a mentor rather than a threat, and the realization that he'd waited patiently for exactly the right moment to use it against her left her furious in a way the rest of the scandal hadn't. Going public with what they'd uncovered risked her being accused of embezzling from her own company, a charge that could end her career regardless of the truth behind it. The board convened again in an emergency session, and Preston declared with total confidence that Eleanor had been quietly using the charity program as a personal fund, staging the disguise afterward purely to redirect attention from her own misconduct. Eleanor couldn't deny that her family's name appeared directly on the paperwork, and for a moment even Walter Byrne, the board's chairman and largest independent shareholder, looked genuinely uncertain about where the truth actually rested. Marcus, remembering how invoices had once been coded at the small restaurant he ran with his late wife, noticed something buried in the transaction records that the professional forensic team had somehow overlooked entirely. The routing number embedded in each transfer matched the founding date of Whitfield House itself, not the founding date of the Whitfield Family Trust, a detail that made no sense unless someone had used it deliberately as an internal marker. Renee dug further and found an electronic signature generated from a computer inside Preston's own office, timestamped on nights he'd publicly claimed, with receipts to prove it, to be traveling somewhere else entirely. Walter, 68 and a shareholder for nearly 3 decades, had built his reputation on refusing to take sides until the numbers left him no other choice, and he remained unconvinced by circumstantial detail alone, demanding proof that Preston himself had personally profited from the stolen money rather than simply mismanaging it through carelessness. Colin, abandoned by Preston the moment he became inconvenient, agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for reduced consequences, handing over a full list of shell companies along with a detailed timeline of every transfer he'd personally authorized on Preston's instruction. Just before the final vote, Colin suddenly withdrew his cooperation entirely, terrified after Preston threatened to strip him of the pension he'd spent nearly 2 decades building, leaving Eleanor's case dangerously incomplete at the worst possible moment. Eleanor called an emergency strategy session that night, and for the first time since the investigation began, her voice carried real uncertainty as she admitted they might walk into the boardroom without enough to win. Marcus, sitting across the table with the recording of Preston's bribe still saved on Renee's secure server, reminded her they still had his own testimony, imperfect as it was. And that sometimes the truth spoken plainly by one person willing to say it out loud carried more weight than a stack of documents nobody wanted to read closely. The board convened its final session inside the very same banquet room where Eleanor had once been refused an empty chair, the chandeliers glowing over the same tables that had witnessed her humiliation weeks earlier. Preston opened by demanding her removal, citing incompetence, reputational damage, and gross financial mismanagement of the very charity program bearing her family's name. Eleanor didn't try to deny every mistake laid before her, admitting openly that she'd trusted flawless reports from her own subordinates for too long and had grown dangerously distant from the people actually keeping her restaurants running each night. Then Marcus walked into the room. Not to deliver praise for Eleanor, but simply to describe plainly and without embellishment exactly what he'd witnessed the night she walked through the front door disguised as a stranger. He described a restaurant that advertised compassion on its menus while turning hungry people away at the door, staff too frightened of losing their jobs to speak a single word in protest, and a manager willing to fabricate evidence to remove the one employee who refused to look away. He noted, without raising his voice, that leadership had only recognized the truth of what was happening once a billionaire personally endured the treatment ordinary people endured every night. He added that he wasn't standing there because he wanted a title or a settlement, but because somewhere in the company there were still servers afraid to say out loud what he was finally saying now, and somebody needed to go first. A few board members shifted uncomfortably, and used to being addressed so plainly by someone none of them would have recognized on the street a month earlier. Renee followed him with the complete financial picture, laying out the recordings, the shell companies, and the falsified reports in careful, methodical order that left little room for doubt. Colin reappeared at the very last moment, and after Eleanor publicly guaranteed that every employee's earned pension and wages would remain legally protected regardless of the outcome, he finally delivered his full, unedited testimony. The room stayed silent for a long moment after Renee finished speaking, the only sound the faint tapping of rain against the tall windows, the same windows Eleanor had stood outside only weeks before. Preston tried once more to speak, his voice thinner now, less certain, but Walter raised a hand and asked him to sit down. Walter listened to everything without interruption, weighed the evidence carefully against Preston's rehearsed denials, and ultimately cast the deciding vote against him. Preston was removed from the company that same afternoon, his accounts frozen pending formal investigation, and the complete file handed directly to federal authorities before the sun went down. In the quiet aftermath, the board offered Marcus Preston's now vacant position as Chief Operating Officer, and his answer surprised nearly everyone still sitting in that room, including Eleanor. Marcus declined the promotion outright, explaining that one act of kindness on one rainy night didn't automatically qualify him to run operations across 180 restaurants scattered across the country. He told the board, with the same steady honesty he'd carried through the entire ordeal, that handing a struggling waiter a corner office would make for a satisfying headline but a poor decision, and that the company needed real structural change far more than it needed a symbolic promotion. Instead, he accepted a newly created role overseeing community experience, insisting on 3 conditions before he'd take it at all. Every dollar of tips earned by staff would belong entirely to staff, with no exceptions carved out for management. Every restaurant would be required to serve genuine, verifiable charity meals, with community partners signing off on every meal served, so no phantom table could ever again hide inside a spreadsheet rather than simply logging numbers that looked good on a quarterly report. And any complaint an employee raised would travel directly to an independent office outside the normal chain of command, safe from the kind of quiet deletion that had buried Marcus's own complaints for months. Eleanor retained her position as chief executive, though she willingly surrendered a measure of her authority, allowing a newly formed employee council to oversee the charity program going forward with real, enforceable power. Every dollar siphoned from the Every Seat Fund was returned in full, and employees who'd been quietly pushed out for speaking up in the past were offered their jobs back or fair compensation, their choice entirely, a gesture that took months to complete, but one Eleanor insisted on overseeing personally rather than delegating to lawyers. Colin lost his position permanently, though Eleanor refused to let him become the sole face of a much larger failure, telling reporters openly that the culture allowing this kind of behavior had existed because leadership permitted it to exist for years, and that firing one man without changing the system beneath him would only guarantee another. Colin eventually took his place. 1 year later, Marcus opened the very first restaurant built entirely around his new model. A modest, warmly lit space he called the second chair, its doors open wide to anyone regardless of what they wore or what they could afford. The dining room smelled of fresh bread and rosemary, the walls painted a warm, unfussy cream, and along one side a chalkboard listed the names of the community partners who delivered real meals to real people every single night. No phantom table hiding anywhere in sight. Marcus had chosen the location himself, 2 blocks from the old restaurant he'd once run with his wife, close enough that some of his oldest regulars found their way back to him within the first week. Nora came for the opening night, standing quietly near the door as she watched her father's name catch the light on a simple brass sign above the entrance, pride written plainly across her face. She hugged him tightly before slipping inside to help seat the first guests, whispering that her mother would have loved this place, and Marcus had to turn away for a moment to compose himself before the doors opened to the public. Eleanor arrived after closing hours, dressed in nothing more elaborate than jeans and a plain coat, completely alone without a single assistant trailing behind her, the street lights catching the last of the evening rain on her shoulders as she pushed open the door. She looked at the empty chair across from Marcus's table and asked whether anyone was sitting there yet. Marcus pulled the chair out for her, the same motion he'd made the night they first met. "I saved it for you," he told her. The story closed on a simple, unhurried meal shared inside a dining room that had already emptied for the night. 2 people who no longer needed disguises or titles to understand exactly who the other person was. Eleanor no longer had to pretend to be poor to learn who around her could be trusted, and Marcus no longer needed wealth or power to prove the value of the life he'd quietly built for his daughter. What grew between them afterward was something closer to equal footing than either had expected when it began, not a chief executive and a waiter measuring each other across a gap neither could close, but 2 people who'd finally learned to see past the roles the world had assigned them, and to see each other instead. Outside, the rain that had followed the whole story from its very first night finally eased into a quiet drizzle, tapping softly against the windows of a restaurant where, for once, no chair sat empty because someone had been turned away, only because someone was still on their way to fill it.